Joining us shortly. I have a couple of things that I want to do a brief opening statement. Department of Finance and the Legislative Analyst's Office are coming up, but there's a few things that I want to just say before we get started because I feel really passionately about some of the things that we're going to be discussing in the next few days. As we heard last week, the governor has decided that there is about an additional $5.5 billion worth of cuts that we are going to have to consider, and we welcome you here today to discuss those cuts. I understand from this morning that there are, in fact, an additional $3 billion worth of cuts that will be coming from the governor's office. I just want to start this discussion out, and I really want to have an open and solid debate about this because I think that the public deserves no less. In my opinion, what we are going to be considering are pretty severe and very horrible cuts, including eliminating programs such as CalWORKs, which benefits mainly single women with young children who are working at minimum wage jobs. Eliminating Healthy Families, which provides health care for poor children, many of whom are sick with preventable illnesses. Further cuts to IHSS, which will mean many elderly and disabled folks will not be cared for. Deep cuts to the administration of justice, which will limit access to justice for those people that are not wealthy enough to afford lawyers. And additional cuts to K through 12 and our UC and CSU system. Before we get, I want to talk a little bit about kind of the political backdrop that this is happening in, because I think we're heading into some territory that personally I do not want to go into. I have to take a look at what the conservative leader Grover Norquist has said. This is what it looks like to starve the beast. This is what it looks like to shrink government to the size where it can be drowned in the bathtub. This is the dismantling of the New Deal, and it's happening here, and it's happening now, and it's happening right before us, and we can't shy away from discussing this. As we heard from the Comptroller and the Treasurer last week, California is standing at the edge of the fiscal cliff, and it has a gun to its head. It shocks the conscience to think that we have to throw sick children off of state-supported health care to satisfy the bankers on Wall Street. I said last week after the hearing on Friday that what we're really doing here is debating the kind of California that we want for our future. We're now looking at a California that no longer invests in education. We're looking at a California where only the wealthy can afford a college degree. We're looking at a California where we neglect our elderly, our disabled, our women, and our children. This used to be the Golden State. Now it's a sorry state. And this is not my California. But it's someone's California. This is the governor's vision of our future. And unfortunately, it is the vision of many of the Republican leaders around the state. What the chair of the Republican Party in Sonoma County, in my own hometown, said just a few days ago after the May 19th initiatives failed, he said, and I quote, "We look forward to draconian cuts to social services." And here they are. Now, I don't know if my colleagues here share that vision, and I tend to think it's not universally supported because the Republicans in the legislature know more than most what shutting down these services means, and they're the ones that will have to cast the votes for this proposal. And I said, this is not my vision, and I'll go a little bit further out on the limb that I'm already out on now and say I don't believe it's the vision of most, if not all, of my Democratic colleagues. But it is the governor's vision, and it's here before us, and it's serious. And I'll tell you this, I'll close half the state prisons before I stop educating the young African American men and Latinos who will otherwise someday fill those prisons. I'll search every oil well in the state before I let our elders rot alone in their homes for lack of attention. I will gladly pay an extra 5 or 10 cents on every soda or every bottle of water I drink before I let poor children suffer and die for lack of medical treatment. I'll turn over every leaf and every rock in this state, and I'll shake every sofa cushion for loose change before I accept the undoing of our state and our collective future. But with this proposal, the governor's made it very clear he'd rather throw women and children out of the lifeboat before he raises taxes. And because of the 2/3 vote requirement in this state, and because several of our Republican colleagues are already under recall because they voted for tax increases in February or because they didn't oppose them strenuously enough, this proposal may get adopted, or some version of it. And so I don't want to give anybody any false hope. But while I chair this committee, we're going to examine sources of revenue, and we're going to look at what cuts those additional revenue sources would mean that we could forego. We're going to look at how many women, children, elderly, and disabled we could continue benefiting, because we have a time of rising need in our state. In my area alone, applications for certain services, certain social services to the county are up by 50%. 50%. And that's in Sonoma County, which is one of the wealthier counties in the state. This is a time of general suffering, and the need for social safety net is higher than ever before. And I believe under those conditions it's unconscionable for the 6th largest economy in the world to turn its back on its own people. And with that, I will let others have an opening statement if they wish to do so. Mr. Nilo.
Madam Chair, those are rather stark words, and I certainly can understand your frustration, but I think that we need to be realistic about a few things. First of all, we are being driven by an economy that has absolutely collapsed. This is nobody's vision of where we wanted to be. We're seeing revenue drops of unprecedented proportions, and I reject the notion that that's any part of anybody's vision. It is indeed before our vision, though, and we must deal with it. I would ask a question, perhaps rhetorically, that if we knew that this was going to take place, what has happened since last fall to now, if we knew that a decade ago, would we have made some different decisions in our budgets of the past 10 years? And would we be in a position to navigate this downturn without the kind of seemingly drastic moves that you state? I think we would. And it would have happened in large part by limiting our growth in spending. Now, when you have programs that of necessity must be cut back because revenues so drastically fall, it's difficult. Every government program that is established creates a constituency. One of the realities is those constituencies are not all equally powerful politically, and so therefore the bringing them in line with existing resources becomes very difficult. But just because that's the case doesn't mean that all of those programs work, all of those programs are justified, and all of those programs should be continued. But the adjustment is nonetheless extremely difficult. And you speak of revenues. Our revenues currently have fallen off, what, now on the order of 20%? And that is with a tax increase that I supported, by the way, the largest tax increase in the history of this state, and it bothers me to say that. I supported that for the reasons that I stated at the time, because of reforms that we achieved, and frankly we need more, and also to avoid a calamitous cash crunch that the state was going to experience. But the problem now is there is no capacity in this economy to further burden it with taxes because they won't generate the revenue. And we will still be faced with the same types of decisions that you lament in your opening statement. So I recognize your frustration, but the fact of the matter is we could have done things differently in the last decade and established reserves to handle more difficult situations. And for having not done that, our decisions now are that much more difficult. But for better or worse, we are going to have to address these things. And I think everybody here would agree, Republicans and Democrats alike, that we would not want to make these drastic reductions that we're going to be facing if we didn't have to. But the unfortunate fact is we have to.
Thank you, Mr. Nilo. Ms. Ducheney.
Let me just try to address both things. I think, and I said a little bit of this the other day, but I think we're going to have to try, as painful as this is to do in as short amount of time as we all think we need to do it in. There is some fundamental changes, and we do have to rethink what is government and what does it do and who does it do it for. And we're going to have to confront the problem of what level of government does what service and with which revenues, because we've gotten so tangled up over the years with local government, and this started back, I'm glad Mr. Nielsen's here, this started back in 1979. It's sort of this recession has made all the chickens come home to roost at one time. For 30 years, we've been able to kind of pretend that something wasn't there. We've let voters and initiatives and legislative actions change that system in a way. I mean, there was substantial increases in the early 90s and tax increases, and by the late 90s we reversed them because the economy was doing so well. In retrospect, obviously, cutting taxes when times are good was a bad idea because then we would have had the reserves to weather the bad times. We've now been in a situation where we really had not recovered yet from the 2002 recession when this one hit. That's why when we tried to put reserves in 03 and 04 and 05, we did create a rainy day fund. We did put money in it, but it rained before we got it full because we only had about 2 years that we put money in it before the new recession started. And so we're now back to a place where, in truth, we have not ever really recovered from the 2002 recession. We have not restored the level of education, higher education in particular, funding that existed before that. And we sort of need to look back at all of those histories. And I agree, we have to target. I mean, I do think we need to reduce, but I don't know how in 2 weeks we're going to figure out the kinds of reductions in the bureaucracies and which programs, as Mr. Nilo says, kind of don't work versus wholesale disruption of the entire system that we've had in place for a long time. And it's not just that these things go by inertia. The problem is we have these caseload increases. We started in 2003 trying to contain the growth in IHSS, in Medi-Cal. This state remains the lowest paying Medi-Cal. You know, we are the most cost effective is probably the best word for it, Medi-Cal state in the entire country, because we did start on Medicare managed care a long time ago, because we have tried to contain those costs, because we have worked on containment even in IHSS, which I think is going to be, a major topic of discussion. Our CalWORKs number has not risen since 1998, other than the recent caseload growth that occurred when the unemployment hit and is now covered 80% by the federal government under ERA. So when you start picking on the most successful programs we have in the state and saying, well, we have to wholesale get rid of the most successful programs in order to do what? And we're going to have to go back to the theory. We're going to have the resources that we're looking at are probably those of 2004-05, but with increased caseload, with increased population, with inflationary increases. So how do we change those? How do we find those programs that we really do think we don't need to do and are unnecessary? But I think the problem we're confronting is that we've actually gotten rid of some of those over the last few years, and we are now at a place where the fundamental services of government, education, basic health and human services, basic public safety are the only things left on the table, and that puts them at risk. And I think that's certainly the chair's frustration and one that's shared by all of us. But it's going to, I don't think wholesale, it goes back to the questions of which of these decisions most help or hurt the economy as a whole. What is the impact on other things, federal funds, actual harm to the economy, and what do we do even as we try to make these kinds of numbers cuts to maintain the economy of the state? We are still today, what, the 8th largest economy in the world? There's something wrong with that picture. Much smaller and less wealthy economies than ours manage to pay for education and health care for their people, and we don't. So something is not connected well here. We are a wealthy state, and we are going to have to figure out how it is that we utilize those resources. And maybe it's not so much new taxes, Mr. Nilo, as restructuring taxes. Maybe we're not getting the right ones. Personally, I never agreed with the sales tax. I think it was harmful to the economy in this environment as an increase and may not be producing the revenues we want. Maybe there are alternatives, ways of producing revenue that are better. And we're going to have to take the patience and the time to explore some of those. I think the LAO had a few options on in their revenue thing that are worth looking at. There were credits that have been giving out willy-nilly since 1998 that we need to relook at and think about what is the structure of what it is we're actually trying to do. And then we're going to have to actually confront this problem with the local governments of who's paying for what and how those services are being provided. So, you know, it's a long road to hoe, and my only comment today, for real, is if finance would please, please, please tell us what your real proposal is, and stop changing it every time we meet. If we could get some semblance of a packaged proposal, because adding these cuts to something else that we have, it doesn't work. So I'm hopeful that when you produce letters on Thursday, we're going to have a complete package that doesn't build off of something else and then change the numbers because, well, yesterday I wanted to refine it and now that one's gone, but I want to do this. Is that one gone? I mean, how do we approach that if we don't get your package as a package? We need that, and we need it before we start trying to act next week. And hopefully you'll have it to us by Thursday so the staff can at least look at those letters over the weekend as we try to prepare for next week. We're making this very difficult on the public to respond. We're asking for public comment. We're trying to take public input, but I don't know that they have any idea what they're responding to at this point because the governor keeps changing the rules every day. So at least try to put your pieces together by this week in a fashion that people can digest. And that gives the LAO and all of us a better chance to respond, and to all of us to continue to look for alternatives. The governor may not, the finance may not be the most creative on how to do some of these things, and maybe we can find better ways to achieve the numbers that we're looking for than the ones that are being presented as wholesale dismantling of longstanding programs.
Any other members wishing to make opening statements? All right, then we will go to the Department of Finance for the present. Oh, before we do that, sorry. We do have printed schedules for the conference committee. Many of the members of the committee have asked for that, so the sergeants will be passing those out. And for members of the public, this schedule that we're getting in hard copy is also posted on the Assembly Budget Committee website, and it will be continued to be updated as we respond to changing conditions. So, Ms. Mata Santos.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ana Mata Santos, Department of Finance. As we talked a little bit about last week, California is facing an unprecedented problem and revenue reduction, and the reductions that we're looking at proposing as a way of backfilling the revenue anticipation warrants are very difficult reductions that are hard to that we don't come to lightly. The challenge that we face is, one, a substantial revenue shortfall and a very substantial budgetary gap. The second is looking at what are the options available to you and available to us in light of the federal rules, maintenance of effort requirements, and other constraints that are placed on us that make some reductions have much larger implications and result in additional general fund gap. So we've gone to a series of options that are allowable, as they're not impacting mandated federal programs, and that are achievable and that have a substantial cash benefit in the budget year. You have a couple of different pieces of paper before you. The first is final numbers for the workload budget. Generally, these are the same workload budget numbers. It's our problem size definition. It's roughly the same as the one that we discussed before. The LAO has noted that that our revenues, there's different revenue assumption between the LAO and the Department of Finance, and we are going to be recognizing the $3 billion shortfall that the LAO has mentioned as a potential shortfall, bringing the total problem to solve for to 24.3. We will have those additional solutions to you by the end of this week for additional solutions to address that $3 billion threat. These address the revenue anticipation warrant and address the 5.5. By the end of this week, we will have the additional solutions to address the $3 billion threat that the LAO has mentioned in their analysis for total solutions of $24.3 billion.
When do you expect by the end of the week? Does that mean close of business Friday, noon Friday, early Friday morning?
Thursday, as originally promised.
We will have them to you as soon as we can by the end of the week, and I will come back later with what particular time we'll be able to achieve that by.
The problem that we're having here is we promised the public a transparent, open process. We promised the public a real meaningful opportunity to weigh in on this process, and we are starting with public hearings tomorrow, and the thousands of folks that we expect to come and testify aren't going to know what to testify to. We may have to repeat the entire public hearing all over again based on what cuts we may get by the end of the week. I mean, this is creating chaos, really, in the public process. And as a legislator, I have a really hard time promising the public the opportunity to weigh in when the governor's office really won't cooperate with doing that. And I hate to put it that bluntly, but that's what's happening. And we continue to get revised figures. Nobody knows what to work with. So, and nobody knows when we can work with them. So Wednesday we've got a hearing, Thursday we've got a hearing, and now we may or may not get the information by the close of business Friday for a hearing on Monday.
We will have those solutions to you by close of business on Friday, and we will endeavor to get them to you before then. And we appreciate the challenge. The challenge that we're facing is also that the circumstance is unprecedented. The scope of the problem is, when we look at historical examples to try to figure out exactly what our forecast would be, those examples in history are very different than this situation, and none have us at the level of economic problem that we're looking at. So we will have those to you by close of business on Friday, and we will endeavor to have it before then. And we appreciate the challenge, and thank you for working with us on that.
I appreciate that, and I understand. I mean, I'm expressing some frustration. I'm sure you're dealing with some frustration as well, but my understanding was we had revenue figures, and I don't believe those have changed significantly. So at some point we have to have some certainty about the numbers we're all dealing with. And as Senator Ducheney said, it changes every time we meet. I almost feel like we should stop meeting for a while to allow things to settle down. I'm not going to do that. My colleague is saying don't do that. But it feels like it's that chaotic. And I think we need to get some certainty here, get some numbers, finalize those numbers, firm them up, and then let's work on that. So close of business Friday. We have your word on that, and we will appreciate your doing that.
We will have the solutions towards $24 billion. I do have to note that we will continue looking at the economics through the month of June, and if and things are dynamic, and as the information changes, we will be sharing with the committee our latest information, our latest take on the size of the budgetary gap, to make sure that we're working towards addressing our best sense of what the problem is in the 9-10 year. Thank you. So the first is workload. It's only a $7 million change there for the prior workload definition. The next is the general fund update, and this reflects the underlying solutions to address the revenue anticipation warrants being removed as a solution. Generally, The reserve is slightly higher than our prior reserve. So we're looking at 2.1. It says at the top, with all proposed solutions, including solutions to backfill ROS. It's not, the first one's workload. This second one is with solutions. No, it looks like this. The other one that looks like that one. Other heading. Oh, you
The
only
one
got
we're
one?
looking
Oh.
at should say 2009-10 May revision with all proposed solutions, including solutions to backfill ROS.
No. Oh.
Well, the same document?
And on your workload budget, on your May revision based on this, how much of this is actual, how much of this is increase as opposed to actual out-of-pocket money? I mean, some of the workload budget, the reason why it's workload is because it's got projected increases in there. Some might be due to demand, but other parts of it have to do with COLAs, things like that. So how much of this is actual real dollars from one year to the next as opposed to just the increase portion?
Most of the cost of living adjustments are already not included in
Okay.
8, 9, and 9, 10 because those have been generally suspended in the budgets that you've passed to date. Generally, of the problem, the $21 billion problem, the single largest factor is the revenue change, and that's roughly $12.4 billion of the problem. When we look at the other workload adjustments, there's a couple of other factors. One is an increase in caseload and program costs. So, and those are in two separate sets of areas. First is the receiver costs are increased by $500 million in 2008-9, and that is reflected in these numbers. Contract medical costs are up by that amount. We also have caseload increases in the Health and Human Services area, as Senator Cheney mentioned, largely based on what we're seeing in the economy and associated caseload costs in Medi-Cal, Medi-Cal, CalWORKS, and in-home supportive services. Sometimes it's hard with the year-over-year to discern what the numbers look like because there's interactions with the federal funds. So, for example, while CalWORKS has increased by $1.1 billion on a year-over-year basis due to caseload increases, the actual general fund component is not increasing to the same level because the federal funds are picking up a higher share of the expenses than they previously did. And the last piece that's also a substantial increase that was included in the April letters we sent to you is higher costs associated with financing the plan through the year based on some of the constraints that the controller and the treasurer spoke to you about last week.
How about state payroll and benefit costs?
Generally, state payroll and benefit costs are lower because of the impact of the furloughs and the solutions that we included in the prior budgets. So if we look at overall state operations, the big increases tend to be in enrollment, caseload, and population in different programs.
Okay. Now, you said a decline of $12 billion in revenue. Is there a particular area of revenue that's down? I mean, is it the personal income tax? Is it sales tax revenue, property tax revenue? Can you give me an idea where that's focused at?
All of the above. Some of the changes from the.
No, I know.
So it's generally revenues are lower across the board. Some of the reductions that we had seen, for example, before we were looking at really substantial reductions based on capital gains. Capital gains is now playing a much smaller factor just because the base revenue is so much lower than before. But we're looking at reductions in our sales tax. Property taxes, we are property taxes are down about $1 billion in 8, 9, and 9, 10. And we're looking at reductions in sales tax revenue, personal income tax revenues, and corporate profits as well.
So what area did you specifically, so you're saying they're about equal? Is that what you're telling me? Is that where the problem is?
Let me look at the chart. Personal income tax is about $4 billion or so of the total. So
So what's that represent as a percentage of the income normally we would receive under normal circumstances?
personal income taxes are roughly 50% of our revenue. So
Right.
so our revenue loss is going to be greater in personal income taxes because they represent a bigger portion of our revenue base.
And so we're down, what percent are we down in personal income tax?
We're down 3.2% in 8-9 and 8.5% in 9-10.
8.1, okay. And then how about your sales tax?
Sales tax is down 6.5 in 8-9 and 8.7 in 9-10 on a percentage basis.
Okay.
Excuse me, Senator Dutton. Can I just follow up on what Senator Dutton said? Can you just repeat one more time? I didn't hear it. The PIT is down how much? You said it's usually 50% under normal circumstances, as Mr. Dutton stated. What is it down right now?
It's down by about, from our prior, I'm sorry, I added the wrong numbers before, so it's about 5.8 billion with the 2 years combined reduction, and it's 3.2 in 8-9 and 8.5 in 9-10.
8.5, 9-10, and it was 8-9?
8-9 is 3.2, and those are percentages versus whole dollar numbers.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Senator Lowenthal, you had a follow-up? Yeah, I know. Mr. Dutton's not finished. Mr. Lowenthal, did you have a follow-up to that follow-up?
Yeah, I
Okay.
just wanted to.
And then we'll come back to Mr. Dutton.
I recall, I think the first day, the LAO reported that, and I want to understand these numbers in relationship, that for the first time since 1938, we had a reduction, I think, in personal income tax. And you said 1%. How does is that saying that every year since 1938, there has been increases in the amount of personal income tax, and this is the first...
This was personal income, Senator.
Oh, personal
The
income.
base, and it's the equivalent of our kind of gross state product.
Okay, just personal income, total
Yeah, the
personal
size of the
income.
economy had grown at least a little bit in every year since
Every year,
then.
so this is the first time, and that would be, and you said there was a 1%, I think, reduction.
Yes, and I think
overall-
finance is very similar. We're actually 1.1, I believe, and they were at 1% reduction in personal income.
And so that's overall total personal income, and this is the greatest reduction since 1938.
I think it's the only reduction
The
since
only
1930.
reduction.
It's the only reduction since 1938. The reduction in 1938 was 1.2, 1.3%. This is the first time that personal income is negative as and it's not an inflation-adjusted number. So when you look at a 1% reduction, that's real dollars to real dollars. And part of the challenge with personal income is, in 5-6, California received 25% of its total income, or 50% of personal income tax revenue, from 146,000 tax returns. So 1% of taxpayers were paying for roughly 50% of the personal income tax. So when you have a 1% reduction in personal income, that's not equally distributed across the income group. So when our revenues are disproportionately impacted by what's happening to the highest income taxpayers in our state, and how they're doing has a disproportionate effect on our personal income tax revenues. So it's not a one-to-one relationship.
Back to you, Senator Dutton.
Okay, as a matter of fact, I'll move kind of even further along that same line. Okay, on the top 1% of the taxpayers that are paying right now, how far is that number off?
We generally adjust that number looking in retrospect, so I don't have that particular number. However, if we think about, for example, what's happening to capital gains tax as a revenue base of a personal income tax structure, I think we're now looking at about a 65% reduction in our capital income tax revenues.
So it would be safe to say that we're probably, we could be down maybe, 50% or so based on what would be normal from that 1% that pay 50% of the personal income tax. That's where the greatest reduction is taking place, and it's primarily because they're losing money right now too, right?
I don't have a specific percentage, but that population group is being heavily impacted. Largely, the capital gains tax revenues are substantially down, and that's going to come from our upper income taxpayers.
And we right now, and it can be both of you, but right now we've got no reason to assume that this group of investors and taxpayers are actually going to rebound anytime quick here in the next 12 months to the point that we'll see an immediate increase of revenue coming into the state.
we are not looking at we are looking at reductions year over year in 2009 and then again in 2010 to our capital gains numbers. That's built into our assumptions, are reductions in both years. And we're looking at rebounds beginning towards the tail end of this year more broadly in the economy.
Okay.
Same thing, Senator.
And then, so also it would be safe to say that a lot of losses are being accumulated now that it's actually going to be, taken in the next, 2, 3, probably, could be as 4 to 5 years, depending on how they've structured it. So we're not actually going to see a major jump in revenue from that particular group.
There are also some federal tax law changes that come into effect that impact the treatment of capital gains that make the multi-year on capital gains there's factors going in different directions.
Okay. On corporate taxes, where are we at with corporate taxes?
We are looking at a 4.1% reduction in 8-9 and then a 19.2% reduction in 9-10 from prior estimates.
What was that one again?
19.2%.
Okay. Reduction.
On a whole dollars basis, we're looking at about $2.4 billion reduction in our corporate tax revenues for both years combined.
And normally corporate taxes make up what percentage of our revenue?
About 10%.
About 10%, and so that right now is down about 20% on that 10%. That's down a little bit.
It's generally about 10%. It's a little different for the last 2 years because the solutions that were included, the revenue solutions included in last September's budget package disproportionately impacted corporate taxes.
Okay. Now, the revenue projections that you're going to be giving us during this when we start asking about forecasting for the future and so forth, they're based on current law, absent any change that we may take place. And then also, I would assume that your analysis doesn't have anything to do with any kind of stimulus that we may be looking at or being able to even, are you even going to be able to calculate, what kind of benefit that it may have in any kind of a revenue projection? If we were trying to come up with some way to increase revenues the old-fashioned way by actually earning the money or having people encourage investment and so forth, are you really are you even capable of even forecasting what type of benefit there may be to doing whatever?
It depends on the extent. So for example, if we're looking at what's the impact on personal income tax revenues associated with certain level of reductions or certain increases, that's easier to forecast than when the relationship between the policy and the actual revenue is a little harder to pin down.
Right.
Generally, dynamic analyses are not our forte.
So basically, right now, what we need to probably do is focus strictly on what we're currently spending money on, and see what areas that as painful as it may be, we're going to have to take a look at what areas we're just going to have to change, even though we may not want to do it. Because I don't see anything happening in the next year to 2 years that's going to give us a sudden increase in revenue. As a matter of fact, it would seem to me that what our problem is going to be is that we've already, we're off the cliff. It's a matter of how, can we soften the landing somehow? So that we can rebound quicker is what's going to happen. But it's, I just don't, we can beat them up over revenue projections, but I got to tell you, this is a moving target even for people that do it for a living, and it's going to be really tough. So I would suggest what we ought to do is we go forward, regardless, because it isn't going to get better anytime quick here, and we're going to have to make some tough decisions no matter what. So.
All right, thank you, Senator. Let's go back then, if we could, Ms. Mata-Santos, to you walking us through the handouts that you gave us. I don't know if you had completed that discussion or not.
So the main change is that with the proposed solutions, as you can see, the bottom line reserve in 9-10 would be $2.1 billion, and in 10-11 we would be looking at a positive reserve of $1.4 billion. The reason why 10-11 looks so much better is because we're replacing the raw with reductions, and those reductions grow in the out years. So our 10-11 forecast would look much better than initially envisioned. With that, unless there's any questions about the general fund update, we can talk through the reductions.
Members have any questions about the general fund update?
Do we have the copy of what you're saying? I don't know, I don't have, no, I only have one.
We only got the one.
We could use some additional copies of workload and non-workload.
Yeah, just to follow this. I only have.
Are you short a copy, Senator?
Yes.
Okay, we'll get you a copy of the
So I have the
workload.
workload.
Okay, the general fund update.
No, we didn't get the workload one either over here. Senator
That's the general fund update. Ms. Mata-Santos, I do have a question. Hopefully you can answer at this point, maybe not. With the revised revenue picture or the revised, your general plan update looking at a much higher or a higher deficit, does this change the cash flow situation? What can you tell me about that?
We will have revised cash flows ready on June 1st. We know that these solutions will generally improve our cash flow. I'm not sure exactly how much they will change our financing needs for the budget year, but we will have those updated projections for you on the 1st, and they will make things better than the $14.5 billion or so number we were talking about last Friday.
Okay. Before we leave this subject, I think it might be appropriate to ask Mr. Taylor if you had some comments on the general fund update that was just presented.
Well, as Finance noted, the turnaround in 10-11 is because you've taken a repayment of $5.5 billion that you had made in that year. You do away with that, and you've replaced it with ongoing solutions. So from your out-year perspective, obviously, if you can do things like that, it's highly desirable. Of course, then you've seen the kind of actions that they're proposing in order to get there. And, Madam Chair, you rightly were concerned about the draconian nature of some of those, because I think it's a whole difference in kind from the kind of options that you saw in the May revision, or, frankly, the kind of options that we put on the table in the back of our document that came out. Hopefully, by taking from a variety of different options and doing some other things, you could avoid some of the more draconian cuts that they've proposed. But as I said earlier, there's no way that you're going to avoid some service level reductions. You just have to do this in as smart a way as you can when you don't have great options in front of you.
All right, thank you. Then let's move into your next handout.
So, Madam Chair, as we've mentioned, generally one of the principles that we looked at was what were programs that were not federally mandated in areas where we could make reductions without being in violation of maintenance of effort requirements established either in current federal law or established by the Recovery Act. The first reduction before you is a reduction to the Rural Health Care Equity Program. This is a state general fund program, no other interactions with federal funds or other components. It essentially eliminates certain healthcare reimbursements that we recently established when the health maintenance organizations pulled out of rural areas for state employees. The second one,
Can you tell me for each one of these items how many that we're eliminating? How many people does that serve? I really want a sense of what we're doing. If we're talking about eliminating programs, not cutting back on reimbursements or not changing eligibility requirements, but when we're talking about eliminating a current state program, I want to know how many people that benefits currently. How many people we're throwing out?
Let me add to that. You need to acknowledge where there is federal fund impacts, because it goes back to my problem of it may not be easy to do the dynamic analysis, but at some level we have to be able to evaluate if there is an adverse overall economic impact to some of these decisions that would be greater than the potential benefit to the budget. I don't know how to, in other words, I mean, the most obvious one to pick on your list is CalWORKs, where you're giving up $3 to $4 billion in federal funds to save a theoretical $1 billion, all of which $4 billion is usually spent at neighborhood businesses buying groceries, because it's low-income families. The tendency in all the economics will tell you they spend their money. So how many small businesses might go out of business if X 100,000 people don't have their $1,000 a month to spend, 3/4 of which is federal dollars? is something, is the kind of thing, the analysis that I'm trying to think about. So this is the most easiest example of that, but we need to understand the federal impacts.
And we'll mention those as we go along, and then I'll provide additional information to the committee on some of the ones regarding people. Yeah. Okay. The second option is furloughs, and here basically this would be assuming savings if the proposed agreements with SEIU 1000 are not ratified by the legislature and we remain at a 2-day furlough. This would be roughly 100,000 state employees that would be impacted. The next one is far more technical of an issue. It's CalPERS. Basically, there's surplus reserves in healthcare costs at CalPERS, and this recoups that. It's $100 million. The next is a reduction to UC and CSU, and this would be the maximum reduction that would be allowable under the MOU. The programmatic impact would depend on how this reduction would be implemented by the segments. The next reduction is to phase out Cal Grants. So what we would be looking at doing would be we would continue.
I just want to ask a clarification. You've got the dollar figures impact on general fund reserve. Mm-hmm. Are these so? For example, UC and CSU, $335 million 1 year, $335 million the next. Is that total cumulative in addition to the cuts we've made before, or are these brand new cuts?
This would be in addition to the cuts proposed
So these
that we're proposing in the May revision, as well as in addition to the cuts that have already been made.
So what is the total number? We're back to the original
That's what we
problem.
need to know.
What is the total number, including the May revision? This is your revised May revision. What is, the February number is a given, so we know that one, okay? What is your total May revision number? And then my second question on this one is the maintenance of effort here. You're reflecting what you believe to be. Is this before or after they accept your revised application?
This is based on the revised application, and the total.
Which hasn't been accepted by the federal government yet.
The federal government has generally given a verbal approval. We're awaiting final approval of that application. This reduction would translate into a roughly $1.4 billion reduction in 8-9. And a roughly $535 million reduction in 9-10, and these reductions would be partially backfilled by federal funds.
Sorry, do that again.
1.4 in 8-9 and 535 in 9-10.
And 10-11?
1.4? What does 1.4 mean?
1.4 billion in 8-9 reductions relative to the Budget Act, and 585 in 9-10 relative to the Budget Act.
And that would be the same 585 for 10-11?
You got to turn on
Mr.
your
Lowenthal,
microphone.
turn on your microphone,
You got to turn on your
please.
microphone if you're going to talk.
And that would also be $585 million for 10-11?
Let me get back to you on 10-11 because there's other changes happening in 10-11 in the base. So for 8-9 and for 9-10, it'd be 1.4 and 585, and then I'll get back to you on 10-11 and the impact.
But the backfill, the federal dollars was only 537, if I recall correctly.
The backfill
Total.
at that stage was 537. However, the federal funds for the state fiscal stabilization comes in 2 stages. Okay. And the remainder of the funds would be allocated, which would backfill an additional portion of that reduction. So we did not allocate the full 4.9. It was only 3.1 that was allocated. Of that 1.9, there would be a portion that would be available to backfill these reductions.
Could
Mr. Lowenthal.
again, it would be very helpful for us if we knew exactly how much of this money is being backfilled so we can really understand the impact. Right now, you're just throwing numbers at us that we have no idea, and you're saying, well, there's going to be some money that's going to be backfilled. We need to know exactly how much money is going to be cut.
Let me suggest, because we don't have the complete numbers yet, and we will hopefully have them by the close of business on Friday, but there may be more coming. We need to have the committee needs to have a comprehensive worksheet to work off of that show all of the cuts, including the February cuts, the most recent cuts, the total cuts for this year and next, and the backfill money that we know is coming, not the money we think might be coming or we might get waivers for, but what we know is going to be there. Because we can only make these decisions, we can only make recommendations if we know the whole picture. We really can't do it in a vacuum. So whoever's going to do that, we need a comprehensive worksheet. Right.
We will have that to you. The next one is the reductions to the Cal Grants program, and essentially this would continue existing awards for a 4-year period, and it would eliminate awards going forward for new students.
Do we have any numbers on that?
I'll get those specific numbers to you. The next one is the decoupling of Cal Grants awards. So basically, this would decouple the relationship between the Cal Grants awards and potential UC and CSU fee increases associated with other reductions. The next one would be to eliminate, and we think,
Let me just,
Senator Ducheney.
so what you're proposing is that no student who is currently in high school or community college would get a Cal Grant next year or forever after?
we would propose that we would no longer have a Cal Grants program, so we would keep existing commitments, but for future students, we would not have a Cal Grants program. They would have reliance on the federal programs.
So we will look forward to hearing from the private institutions next week.
All right, let's go on.
The next one would eliminate general fund support for Hastings College of Law. The next one was, and I'm not mentioning that they have federal fund impacts because they generally don't. So I'll mention federal fund impacts where they occur. The next one is Cal Fire equipment replacement.
When you
Mr.
say
Lowenthal.
eliminate funding for the Hastings, can you tell us what that impact will be on the Hastings College of Law?
Generally, the most direct impact would be that they would have fee increases in order to backfill the level of general fund reduction. They would have to look to other sources instead of the general fund to provide it. The rationale is it's a professional institution, and we believe they have other alternatives to be able to realize, to be able to continue to exist without this level of general fund support.
Well, it's important for us to understand what those consequences really will be, whether in fact it means the closing of the Hastings College of Law, whether it means that they have to rely on other funds, maybe not just in Hastings, but in others. Just what are the implied implications of this?
We'd have no public institution of law other than Bolt in the Bay Area.
Right.
But we just started a new law school last year at UC. Why would we start a new, no, Irvine. Why would we start a new law school when we've had Hastings around for 100 years, which has a marvelous reputation? So you're basically saying it's no longer a public university.
No additional direct general fund support for UC Hastings.
So it's not a UC anymore because it's not a public institution anymore.
Again, we looked at what are available resources to spend, where does the state have the flexibility to be able to make reductions, and that's how we arrived at some of these solutions, is where can we make reductions that do not impact a maintenance of effort requirement or a federally mandated program. And under that way of approaching where we can mechanically reduce general fund without being in violation of a federal requirement, this is such an available option.
Understood. And I think it sounds like we have some interest in exploring more about what the impacts of that will be on the Hastings College of Law. Mr. De Leon.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Just real quick, I'm having a hard time reading this, and the reason why is that I appreciate the proposed cuts that you put in front of us so we can react to it. The current fiscal year, as well as the next fiscal year, as well as the next fiscal year thereafter. What's a little difficult for me to sort of put into its proper context, it's very difficult for me to compare and contrast and juxtapose, if you will. For example, I know on page 1, figure number 4, with regards to reducing UC and CSU budgets, I know that you talked about 1.4, I believe, approximately $1 billion, which includes cuts that we made last fiscal year. I believe the current fiscal year proposed cuts, as well as the upcoming fiscal year cuts in about a month or so, a month and a half. what I would like, and it would help me, and I'm sure it would help other members here tremendously, is if you can tell us the proportion of the overall budget these cuts represent. It's just difficult because it's in a vacuum. If it's $20 and you say you want to cut $2, but I only see $2 you want to cut, I just really have nothing to juxtapose this with. So if you can tell us in the next hearing that we have with your figures that you're going to propose with all the various cuts, just tell us what is it in proportion with the overall budget for that single figure right there. I'd appreciate that very much.
All right, let's go on to something simple like eliminating funding for CAL FIRE.
This basically would be eliminating funding for some equipment replacements. This was an LAO option, and it just defers maintenance costs from this year to next year. It's generally vehicles and other equipment that would be replaced. The next one would be eliminate general fund support for state parks. This would impact a lot of parks in terms of, to the extent that they have fee revenue to be able to remain in operation, and that they can increase fees as an ability to be able to remain open, then that would work in some of the coastal parks and other areas where we have relatively high level of fee revenues. In other areas, we'd be looking at substantial reductions on park closures.
Do we have any idea where those substantial reductions in park closures might occur?
We can provide some information. We have a list of closures associated with a 10% reduction. This would be in excess of that. We think there are some parks that would be fairly profitable, but it could be upwards of 80% of parks not having sufficient fee revenues to be able to continue to operate.
Could you bring that back to us, please?
Will do.
Quick follow-up. And on the park fees, do we have a sense of the percentage increase of those park fees that are going to be put in place? Are they going to go from $3 to $9 or?
The May revision includes a proposal to increase fees at certain parks. Generally, the parks that we're focusing on and the areas where we would be increasing the fees, we're not talking about tens of dollars to fees, and we're talking about the parks that become sold out within the first hour of being made available in a month. We can get you that updated fee schedule for those parks and to give you a sense, but we're not talking about very substantial increases in fee revenues. There's a relationship between how much we increase fees and the extent to which it has a reduction in the number of people who are coming and actual reductions in our revenues. We focus fee increases in the areas where we think they'll materialize and we'll actually get higher revenues because demand is so high.
This is an example of where when we get to Thursday or Friday and all of the actual letters, you got to merge the two proposals. We will not be able to sit here and look at your previous proposal about fees and then top this one on it. You're going to have to figure out how to merge it and say, are you proposing fees? If so, where and how much to meet this goal? However, this goal intersects with your previous goal. I mean, which ones are actually you're proposing to close, like you did last year, and which ones are you proposing fee increases and how much? And you got to put that all in one May revision letter, not two.
In the May revision letters are including all the proposals that affect the department in the single letter, and we will prepare an updated sheet that works through all the different changes so you can see what's the cumulative impact on the different programs. But all that information is in the letters. The next one is special projects. This impacts a couple of different programs in the Department of Aging, the multipurpose senior services programs, and other community-based programs, Alzheimer daycare resource centers, and some of the other programs that are aimed at care coordination and as alternatives to long-term care, nursing home care. And this one has a federal fund impact of approximately $28 million. The next one is eliminating certain state-only programs, and we focused on the state-only programs that will not have a cost shift in excess of the savings associated with them. And these are programs that are currently funded with 100% general fund in the Medi-Cal area. Some of the probably largest component is non-emergency services, breast cancer and cervical cancer treatment, and postpartum care. And this is a fraction of the state-only programs.
Yeah, just a second. We'll go to Senator Dutton in a second. I'm just trying to, maybe my brain is fried, but I'm having a hard time understanding how this is written. Excluding prenatal care, then we would continue providing the prenatal care?
We would continue providing prenatal care.
And then
we've excluded from the proposal programs that we believe would result in a cost shift that is greater to the level of savings. So, for example, prenatal care, we think if that state-only program were eliminated, we would have costs that would be in excess of our savings. So that is not a state-only program that we're proposing to eliminate. There's several $100 million of additional state-only programs that we're retaining, and that we're retaining because we believe if eliminated, it would be a cost shift.
I understand the language. We would be eliminating dialysis?
We would be eliminating dialysis.
My
That's a state-only
father is
program.
going through dialysis right now. I mean, that's a pretty life-threatening thing to remove, to put it gently. Okay. Senator Dutton had a question. Then we'll go
just
to you.
clarification, I want to make sure. Back to number 10, were you talking about adult day health care, or did you say Alzheimer's?
Adult day health care we would retain as a benefit. And here we would be talking about Alzheimer daycare resource centers and adult day care,
Okay.
as well as multipurpose senior services programs.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Ducheney, Assemblymember Blumenfield, and Senator Lowenthal.
I guess the question we'll all have is what makes you think these are not creating the cost shift? The dialysis strikes out, the cancer treatments. I'm not quite sure where you think that's going if it's not a cost shift in excess of savings.
We generally assume a cost shift associated with all of these reductions as it relates to state-only programs. The issue is that we don't assume 100% cost shift. And we
Because
worked.
people will just die and we won't have to take care of them?
We don't think there'll be an excess of 100%. We worked with the department and looked at available research for arriving at these savings assumptions.
Assemblymember Blumenfield, followed by Senator Lowenthal.
My question is along the same lines about the cost shifting. I'm having trouble swallowing it or fully understanding it. What I'd like to know is to see the details behind that cost shift. Is how did you come? I mean, I can't imagine that you eliminate multipurpose senior programs and you're not going to have a huge cost shift to state institutions. And I can't imagine, a lot of these non-emergency services being eliminated and not having a much greater cost on your emergency rooms. But you're saying that you've done the analysis and the numbers pencil out. So I'd love to see that analysis and better understand it, and also present that analysis to the public, because I think that's something people really are going to want to understand and see before accepting this kind of thing.
Senator Lowenthal.
Also, it seems to me that maybe this is a kind of an oversimplification, but and I too don't understand the cost shift and that you're taking a cross-sectional analysis versus a longitudinal analysis. What I mean by that is if we cut this service now, what else immediately will be picking up the service? But I'm also interested in what are the longitudinal impacts of that? Are we going to have more ultimately in the next year or 2 years? If we eliminate preventive services, what will ultimately happen? Because it's one thing just to look at an immediate cost shifting and looking at other services, and it's another to understand that we're setting policy and really going to have long-range implications. And I need to understand a more longitudinal analysis. What is this going to do to the state and to these folks over a period of time?
And for the benefit of members and the public as well, we will be debating this in much more detail. It's currently scheduled for June 5th.
Okay.
We need to get the final figures. We need to get a little more detail. So asking for more detail is, I think, appropriate at this point. But we do have, at this time, June 5th set aside for discussion of health issues. Go ahead.
The next one, as you know, the May revision includes $750 million in savings associated from working with the federal government on additional flexibility to be able to realize savings in the Medicaid program. This increases that savings target by $250 million. There's a variety of different options, both of savings proposals as well as additional federal funds that the state might be able to access for longstanding issues between the state and the federal government that would be available to us to achieve that billion-dollar target. The next one is a reduction in the skilled nursing facility cost of living adjustment. This is basically a rate reduction impacting nursing homes. It's also federally allowable.
It's federally allowable because nursing homes are actually not federally mandated. Am I correct?
Long-term care is, nursing homes are federally mandated for categorically eligible populations. This is allowable because it's a rate reduction, and a rate is not precluded by the maintenance of effort requirements.
Right, but one thing we need to look at on this one is who's going there, how much, and how has that caseload and cost been going? Because I think this one's been climbing, and if we're going to do a relook at Medi-Cal and we're mixing in IHSS, we're at some point going to have to figure out how those all balance. And maybe in certain cases the in-home or this pre-treatment and preventative treatment is more cost-effective, if you will, than the long-term care. And we're going to have to rethink how the rate, I mean, because they've been getting rate increases consistently every year. I mean, proposing this one doesn't roll them back to 2004 like you're rolling everybody else back or taking them off the map.
Since AB 1629, there have been a series. Nursing homes are paying a fee, and there has been a substantial rate increase to nursing homes. We generally spend, I believe it's $5.5 billion total funds in nursing home care. Roughly $2.8 billion of that is general fund. We have been seeing general rate increases in this area associated with AB 1629 and the mechanism established in law where nursing homes are paying a fee and they're receiving a rate increase associated with that fee that was assessed and established by that legislation. This would basically suspend the cost of living increase for the coming year. The fee would remain in effect. And as you mentioned, Senator Cheney, there are portions of the nursing home programs that are federally required. There are other portions that are not, and that are an optional benefit. And it's different for different populations. The next one is a reduction to general fund support for AIDS drug assistance programs and for other AIDS programs. The AIDS drug assistance programs proposals are LEO options and looking at changing the cost sharing in the program as well as limiting the formulary and the covered drugs. There are other reductions to programs that we fund in addition to ADAP, such as different home and community-based programs, as well as dollars that we spend on HIV counseling and testing and other such services.
Mr. Leno.
So I'm sorry I had to step out to cast some votes in appropriation. Are we making comments as we go through this, or just...
We are
All right.
sometimes making comments and asking for further information, but I did remind the committee that on June 5th we do have some substantial period of time devoted to debating these issues, and there's still additional information to be arrived at from the Department of Finance.
So just a couple of brief questions. Can you remind us how many people statewide participate in ADAP? It's tens of thousands, I know.
It's definitely tens of thousands. It's in the neighborhood of 50. I'll get back to you with a specific number.
And I know that we've been talking, if not debating, about static versus dynamic analyses. Not something like ADAP in particular literally keeps people alive day to day in ways that are not debatable. And so if we're going to even consider this, the kind of information I would like from you just in the raw numbers, not even talking about the human devastation, but we have to look at some dynamic realities of this, as in how many of these 50,000 will, without a doubt, find their way to a hospital within a month or 2 or 3. What kind of costs will that result in? And really begin to understand what a life-saving program this is. And this impacts, clearly the epidemic began in the LGBT community, but the highest rates of infection now in new cases are in, among women and communities of color. And so this impacts everybody.
And along those same lines, I notice you you propose expanding some cost sharing and reducing some programs, but eliminating HIV counseling and testing. I mean, the testing itself in particular seems, for public health reasons, to be not so advisable. Could you talk about why you would choose that for elimination?
First, there are some changes in current law, and HIV testing is now covered by managed care plans. This, in some ways, this provision of base general fund dollars was included to fund local health departments to be able to perform this function. There have been some changes in other laws that impact the extent to which there's other coverage for testing resources. And our focus here was on protecting the program that we think has the most direct relationship to costs in other areas, and that is ADAP. And that's why we look at continuing to provide the core ADAP program, increase cost sharing where we think it's appropriate to, where we think we can afford to do so, looking at some changes in the formulary to make some changes to not cover some of the drugs that are not federally required, and we make reductions in other areas just based on the available general fund resources and the extent to which there are other services or other funding schemes that are covering some of those costs.
But on testing itself, it seems to me people are, as they lose their jobs, they're also losing their health care coverage. And even prior to this time of high unemployment, people were losing health care coverage. There's not any other source of funding for that, is there? If somebody's got no health care coverage and the state says we're no longer going to do HIV testing, where do they go?
Some of these tests may continue to be, and some of the testing function may continue to be funded out of health realignment and out of local health departments and their existing base budgets, and there may be some other sources of funding, private coverage being another example. Again, we looked at what were some of what are the type of reductions that the general fund situation demands, and what changes can be made without impacting a federally required service, and that's why we've arrived at many of the reductions that we've arrived at.
Okay, I understand that. I'm getting to the conclusion that I think maybe the committee needs to have some information from some public health officials as to some of the elimination of some of these programs that really do affect public health and safety, and this would be one of those, I would think. All right, unless you're Mr. Bloomfield.
Doesn't ADAP also leverage federal funds like Ryan White funding? What I'd like to see actually is some analysis of how much federal funding this would cost us.
This would put us out of compliance with the Ryan White maintenance of effort requirements, and they look at how much we are on a dollar per dollar basis, and it reduces it similar to how Medicaid reductions work.
50% match, is that what it is, if I remember correctly?
It's not exactly a 50% match. It's a block grant dollar amount, and it has a matching spending requirement. So it's not necessarily dollar for dollar, but it has a dollar for dollar generally impact based on the loss of federal funds. We'll get that one for you, but it's not 50-50 match. It's not like Medicaid is, for example.
But it could be meaning the loss of about $50 million.
Let me get back to you with a specific number. It would be tens of millions of lost federal funds.
Thank you.
This goes back to an example of my original question. If we're going to impact the delivery of preventative AIDS medication by $100 million by virtue of this action, we need to understand that, whatever that number is. And also, if you're saying there is a maintenance of effort, we ought to understand what that maintenance of effort is. Maybe there is a way to reduce the program or get greater cost share or do some other things to it, but we ought to know what the maintenance of effort level is to figure out if there are some modifications that could be made within that, and also understand the total impact again, to the economy and the potential cost shift of eliminating really not only our own funding, but eliminating the federal funding too.
The maintenance of effort for this program is based on what the state spending is. So the federal government looks at state spending on a fiscal year basis in comparison to a different fiscal year, and it works. It's not like a matching program. They give us
Like CalWorks.
closer to CalWorks, yeah. So we'll get you the specific federal funds for this one, but it's
right.
tens of millions.
Let's move on to eliminating healthy families.
Eliminating healthy families, this would impact 930,000 children. And this program has a matching fund of 2-to-1 federal funds, so we would lose roughly $500 million in federal funds with this reduction.
Well, it's an elimination.
Yeah.
Any questions on this, members? I think people are just kind of letting it sink in. All right, we can move along then to the next one.
The next one is two reductions. The first is a reduction to mental health managed care services. These are mental health services provided by the counties. It's roughly $64 million associated with eliminating the non-federally required services, and that would impact matching funds, and the matching funds for this program is Medicaid, so we're looking at roughly 60-40 matching funds for these services. The balance of the reduction is associated with the early periodic screening, diagnosis, and treatment services, and this would be roughly $28 million. Again, these dollars leverage federal funds, and they leverage Medicaid funds, and we would be making a reduction that would essentially eliminate general fund support for recently expanded programs, and the counties may be able to use Prop 63 resources to be able to backfill for those programs if they choose to maintain them.
This is the program that for years we still haven't paid them back for 2001 or something yet. Where are we on that whole issue? Didn't we? I mean, we had to recalculate the thing, and the numbers were all whacked out for 3 or 4 or 5 years.
There was a problem in the 6-7 fiscal year associated with prior claims based on the Medicaid change between, there are a couple things. One was an issue and an underlying change in the estimating methodology, and a better methodology to have a better handle on program costs. The other was a challenge associated with Medicaid switching from accrual to cash, and EPSDT not making the same switch. So some dollars were swept that in fact were not available based on the two programs being budgeted on a different basis. We built out a payment schedule, and I will get back to the committee with whether all of those payments have been completed.
Can I ask a follow-up? On the Prop 63, you sort of said some of it could be backfilled. Isn't that expressly prohibited? And how would we go about backfilling in that regard?
The Prop 63, you're correct, it has a non-supplantation requirement, which is why we would not be saying that we'd be making these reductions and that they would be backfilled with Prop 63 funds. However, when we make this reduction, counties have Prop 63 dollars available, and if they choose to invest those funds in these services, they could do so. They're allowable costs because they're for community mental health services. So this is consistent with the Prop 63. The maintenance of effort requirement for Prop 63 looks at what the spending levels were in 2003-04. These have been expansions or increases as it relates to the EPSDT. They have been increases since 3-4 to our overall general fund outlay for mental health services. These reductions, the state could make these reductions, and the local government the counties may choose to use their $63 to pay for these services. We could not mandate that they do so because they make determinations about how to spend those dollars.
Mr. Nealon, did you have a comment, or was that just a physical comment? No verbal commentary here. Okay. All right, let's move on then to CalWorks.
CalWORKs, this would be, this is not a federally mandated program, so we can make this reduction without losing any of the Recovery Act dollars. We would be looking at eliminating the CalWORKs program and making associated changes to child care services. This would result in a loss of about $4.2 billion in federal funds. A portion of that is the Recovery Act dollars, and then a portion of that is the base federal funding for the program. And again, it's a reduction that is federally allowable.
Well, but this is one where you better analyze the cost shift. I mean, this is a ridiculous cost shift. I mean, to I don't know what, to homelessness, to no rent, to
counties.
people, to counties, to nobody
Corner
paying
grocery
rent.
stores.
Yeah.
Everybody.
Yeah, this is one I think where we're going to have a lot more analysis than a line item. I do have a question, though. Are there any other states in the union that have eliminated this program, or their comparable programs?
Our program is more generous than most other states, both in terms of the level of grants that we provide, which are generally much higher than the rest of the country.
I want to know if any states have eliminated it.
Eliminated it. Let me get back to you with whether any have eliminated. Many have 2-year hard time limits and have much smaller programs than we do. I will get back to you on whether any have completely eliminated the program.
Yeah, I know there's modifications we could do that might be consistent with things that other states have done, but I'm not aware of any other state that has completely eliminated the program, and I would be curious to know. Any other questions on this item, Mr. De Leon?
I don't envy the position that you're in right now, and I know it's very difficult for you to have to represent the governor's budget before us. So I know this is a very difficult task. So again, I want to underscore that I don't envy you at all whatsoever. But let me add this as a real suggestion that I would deeply appreciate, and I think all the members would also too. I think I'm not going to get too much into reactions with regards to proposed cuts, because I know we'll have plenty of time tomorrow and the next few weeks. It'll be extremely helpful if you provide deeper analysis. And the reason why is it's quite easy to take a butcher knife and just butcher up the budget and then present us with something, and we're all going to react to it one way or the other. We're all going to react to it. That's our role. That's our responsibility. But we're going to have folks who are going to come in tomorrow, and it's going to be very emotional. It's going to be very heartbreaking. We're going to have press who's going to be here tomorrow. We're going to have the public as a whole up and down the state of California, whether they're watching this or not, or whether it's clipped onto YouTube. It's really important that we're as transparent as possible. So we know that we have the most detailed information to make some very difficult decisions. And the point in case is, for example, number 17, how the proposal is to eliminate CalWORKs altogether. And although it's not federally mandated, so there would be no penalties, we lose roughly, as you say, $4.2 billion. That needs to be detailed, I believe. Secondly, when we go to, for example, number 15, when we eliminate Healthy Families programs, the impact, as you say, is 930,000 children. Because I'm not an expert on this issue in particular, it's a 2-to-1, I should say, matching fund. We lose, according to you, federal dollars, $500 million. This information we need, and it does need to be detailed so we can make, if there's such a thing right now with the draconian cuts that are going to ensue, some smart cuts in the way we go about this. As Mr. Leno just articulated, as well as Mr. Lowenthal, with regards to ADAP on the previous page, as we tempt, at least, to say intelligent cuts, if we eliminate either dialysis or ADAP programs to these individuals, then consequently they'll end up where? They'll end up in the emergency room care center. And if they end up in the emergency room care center, we have to score in what those potential costs are. The most detailed information that we're provided helps us make some intelligent, hopefully, decisions, even though they're going to be very emotionally and heart-wrenching. So I ask you at DOF, again, I don't envy your position, but I ask you and your staff and your assistants to provide us as detailed as many details as possible, what the consequences are, what the potential consequences are with regards to losing any federal funding, what have you, et cetera. That, I believe, for all of us would be extremely helpful so we can move forward with this. Because, again, going back, if we don't know if it's $100 overall budget for X program and the proposed cut is $20, I have no clue what the budget is for that department for a given fiscal year or for X program. So that helps us as much as detail as you can provide us. Please do that.
Will do.
One other question on this item that I have at least is, do we know how many people this will affect?
It's roughly 450,000 cases.
450,000 cases. Are those individuals or families?
It's a total number of cases. There's usually the standard case is 2 children, 1 parent per case.
Okay. All right.
10,000 kids on 900,000 children that are not the same 930,000 that you're eliminating from healthy families, because these kids are eligible for Medi-Cal. So that's, between the two, you're talking almost 2 million children.
And these children would be able to continue being eligible for Medi-Cal services. So,
Right. No, I
and
understand.
as well as food stamp services.
But they wouldn't have a house, so it would be okay. All right. I just, one more thing is we're trying to outline information we want for when we get to next week. In all of these health and human services issues, are your numbers just eliminating service, or are you eliminating positions in the departments and the agencies?
We're generally eliminating positions in all of the departments and the agencies in association with the reduction. So, for example, here we're eliminating the state operations for welfare to work. Similarly, in the AIDS reduction, we're eliminating state staff. It just, as we eliminate this program function, we are eliminating the state staff.
Well, some of these we may want to separate that out and eliminate the state staff and not the direct service. So we need to kind of break that out a little bit.
Okay.
And we're providing all that detail in our letters and estimates, et cetera.
We can move on to number 18.
Sure. The next one is to eliminate state funding for community care licensing, and we would be looking at a fee increase and some program reductions to be able to maintain the critical health and safety standards while being able to accommodate this general fund reduction.
So, in other words, you see the program continuing, but the general fund no longer sustaining the program. It will come from increased fees.
It'd be a streamlined program, but yes, generally the function would continue more streamlined than currently. The next one, we'd be looking at so we'd shift from current gas tax dollars that are spent on local streets and roads, and instead we would be using those dollars to fund debt service costs that are currently for a general fund benefit of roughly $750 million.
The Prop 42 funds?
It's fuel tax dollars that fund local streets and roads. This is kind of a hybrid of an LAO option that LAO looked at a combination of 42 base gas tax. This looks at the portion of the gas tax that gets dedicated to local streets and roads. Instead of funding local streets and roads, it uses it for debt service. We're also proposing to accelerate $700 million in local streets and roads bond funds. So there's a net effect between those proposals.
And what is that net effect?
The net effect is a reduction of approximately $44 million when you take those two pieces into account.
Well, Senator, I think the proposals are pretty different, though. This is an ongoing proposal to take the if I understand it correctly, is to take the 6 cents out of the 18 cents gas tax that currently is distributed to local streets and roads and permanently redirect it to pay for the state's debt service on its bonds, whereas our proposal was a one-time loan that's authorized under the Constitution that would be repaid. We would backfill by the $700 million in 1B that's unappropriated so far for streets and roads to try to mitigate the impact of that cut. But they would have no, over the long run, they would have no change in the monies available at the local level. So it's a very different proposal.
Very different proposal.
Okay, remind me, Finance, of the proposal that was in the February budget until the last night that it was voted on for gas taxes?
There was an increase in the gas tax that would have provided two sets of things. One was reimburse the general fund for prior year debt service costs. And then the second was increase the gas tax in a manner that would provide ongoing general fund relief by paying for the debt service costs. The amount of the gas tax revenue would be in excess of the debt service costs, so there would be an increase in funding there would have been an increase in funding for the transportation programs associated with it.
And there would have been general fund relief from paying the debt service. How much was it, though? I've forgotten the numbers.
Let me see if I find it.
Mr. Taylor, that's right. You can get it to me later. I just wanted to remember, because that was a proposal that everybody minus one had agreed on at one point, so we might want to visit that again.
I'll get it back to you. We provided close to $2 billion in benefit over the 2-year period. So.
Okay. Next item.
All right. The next item is to reduce general fund support for the courts by another 10%, and to require electronic court reporting. The rationale for electronic court reporting is that it would yield savings that would help the courts in the long run manage this level of general fund reduction.
Do you have a sense of whether this means, I know the courts are already proposing to close at least one day a month. Would this be 2 days a month, or should we just shut them down for a week, or should we let all prisoners out who meet the 48-hour deadline, or, I mean, how do you think policy-wise you want to implement this?
We'd be looking at some other efficiencies, changes, ways in which the courts would be able to reduce their costs, such as electronic court reporting, as a strategy to be able to manage that level of reduction.
Electronic court reporting isn't going to give you 10% across the board reduction in the administration of justice. I'm sorry, that's not even close. And with the courts looking at already closing 1 day a month to absorb the cut we've already given them, I don't see any other way to do this other than another day a month. And we're going to run into all sorts of statute of limitations problems, and this is another one of those things where we really need to analyze the downstream impacts, because if courts are closing 1 day a month, and if they close a second day a month, the folks that are going to get hurt are not the ones that can afford private judging. They're not the ones that can afford to go to private arbitration. They're not the ones that are going to be, the criminals that are sitting in jail awaiting prosecution that have a hard and fast statute of limitations or they're out of jail. It's going to be the folks that are in family court. It's going to be foster children. It's going to be other people and other kinds of dependency proceedings. I mean, this has serious human cost to it, and I think, many of us who have not worked in that area of the administration of justice, and I haven't, I've been only in civil courts, we need to know what this means, and we need to know this probably from the Supreme Court as far as how they're going to absorb the costs. And when our budget subcommittee addressed that, it was an extremely difficult hearing, and we heard things we really didn't want to hear, and I think we're going to hear more that we don't want to hear. So this is another one that I think is going to require substantially more analysis and debate. All right, let's go on to the next item.
This would be the May revision includes other proposals to reduce prison population, including commutation of sentences for individuals who are subject to deportation. It also includes prospectively some changes of the wobblers, so that people who commit wobblers would serve their time at the local level instead of in state prison. This population has a great level of overlap with what in the future would be the wobbler population, and it would be basically commutation of sentences of non-violent, non-serious, non-sex offenders 1 year early.
So you're saying we would shift the cost to the local government, right, to pay for this, because you're now shifting it. Is that going to be included? How are they going to pay? How are they going to pay for this?
This population basically their sentence would end earlier, so they would not serve time at the local level.
So there's not any kind of shifting of anything to additional costs at the local level?
their sentence would end early. They would then be in local communities. There are issues associated with changes of crimes that are currently categorized as either a misdemeanor or a felony.
The wobbler, that's what I'm talking.
The wobbler one. That's in the other proposal, and some of those individuals would serve time locally instead of the state, and yes, the local government would pay the costs associated with it.
We need to understand that. Again, you're taking away in one hand money from local government and shifting more towards them, and so we need to hear that very, very carefully.
Mr. Leno?
And again, with regard to impacts to public safety, these are individuals who committed a crime with the sentence and determination left to the discretion of the court. The court looked at all the variables, including priors and such, and decided this is a felony, not a misdemeanor. We're going to reverse that thoughtful process. That's of concern because this is a too broad a brush because we're not differentiating who may have deserved a misdemeanor and who got the felony. These are those who were determined to have committed felonies, not misdemeanors. Those courts had reason to do what they did, and we're taking that all away.
In the context of the available general fund resources, in the context of who we have in state prison and available options, we think this is a better alternative to others, but there are very difficult reductions that we don't come to lightly.
That's separate.
Okay. Next item, please.
Right. The next item is reduction to corrections, contract expenditures, reductions to rehabilitation programs, and other reductions to CDCR. This would mean substantial reductions to the rehabilitation programs that have been increased over the last couple of years based on the general fund position.
Well, excuse me, Madam Chair. This one, first of all, we have not even done the rehabilitation or started or implemented the rehabilitations that the legislature asked for 3 years ago in AB 900. There was rehabilitation money. There was a lot of discussion about that being part of that package. None of that has been implemented. It's 3 years later, 4 years later, whatever it is. And now you're trying to cut back what little bit already exists. I mean, we've been a little tiny bit, and that's moving in the direction that was necessary, that everybody, I think, here pretty much agrees is necessary to deal with the recidivism issues. And the one thing you're looking to cut is that. I want to know how many people work in that department over here at headquarters that are not on the ground doing real stuff. And before I would cut these contracts to people who are doing something useful, we're going to want to see contracts for folks that are not. I mean, and there's a lot of contracts that this department is sending out hither and thither, and there's a lot of folks working at headquarters who could just as easily take some of those vacancies back on the ground and start saving us money in overtime because we have too many vacancies at the prison sites.
And our parole reform package already includes $15 million in reductions to headquarters and substantial reductions to state operations. This, from our judgment in terms of the ways in which we can reduce costs at CDCR, we can look at population and we can look at how much we spend on contracts. Population reductions, the savings will be phased in over time. And in order to achieve the level of savings that we think our general fund situation requires, this is one of the options that we think makes sense.
Mr. Leno.
Could you help us understand better how things work in the real world with regard to termination of some of these positions? Because about 70% of corrections overhead is in personnel, correct? So how much notice does someone have to have? So how do these, I'm curious as to how, even if we did this, if there would actually be $788 million saved in 09-10, or would we only actually get a fraction of that?
The contract expenditures can be terminated much quicker. When we look at personnel reductions, the personnel reductions have a phase-in period. The quickest that we could probably phase out and do layoffs is going to be a 4 to 6 month period. So contract reductions, and there's a substantial amount of these services that are delivered through contracts, can be effectuated much quicker than reductions that require reductions in personnel.
And did we ever project to what degree we would lower our recidivism rate by instituting these programs, because then we have to project how much higher recidivism will go once we repeal them.
We don't have a particular number associated with the impact on recidivism associated with the program expansions. There isn't an agreed upon metric. It's something that's been under development, but there isn't an agreed upon metric.
Thank you.
Mr. Lowenthal.
Can you tell us what our recidivism rate is now?
65.
I just want to hear it from finance.
And I'm not going to remember the right number, so I'm going to defer to your colleagues.
So we can cut that. I mean, it's such a low number that we don't have to worry about that, right?
We believe
Are we
there's
not twice the national average?
We think there's a variety of different proposals that we think make sense as positive impacts to our recidivism rates. We think that, for example, parole reform is an area where we can make good changes that would impact our recidivism rate and would make our program more successful without adversely impacting public safety. The proposals before you are a function of the general fund situation that we face, where we have discretion, where we are able to make those reductions, and how we can make our dollars match. And these are difficult reductions, but they are possible. And in the context of how to reduce CDCR, we think these are better alternatives than others.
Quick follow-up.
Mr. Blumenfield.
I know that there are some federal funds that go into this. The leverage is probably a lot less, I think. But I would like to see, when you do the revision on this, to make it clear how much federal money we're losing when we make these cuts.
You might want to check in with the judge before you come back the next time on this stuff to see what their view of this would be. Well, the judge from the federal court that's overseeing the prisons. The judge that is overseeing that's been threatening to let people out for years because we haven't done enough rehabilitation work, and was overseeing the fact that we were doing this and had not made an order reducing everybody because he knew we were on the path to doing the rehabilitation work. And the reason we did these contracts is because that judge was threatening to let everybody out if we didn't, on a constitutional basis, not having to do with the health.
The reductions in population would reduce our overcrowding rates, which has been a chief concern of the three-judge panel.
Okay, let's go on to the next item.
The next one is to eliminate general fund support for various community health center programs. This would impact different state-only programs. There have been significant increases in federal funding for clinics, but this would eliminate general fund support for programs that serve, it's the Expanded Access to Primary Care program is the largest one. It's also seasonal agricultural migratory workers, rural health services, and other smaller general fund programs.
So what were you going to do with the 99 money that was paying for this if you're not going to pay for these things?
This is the general fund component of those. There are other reductions in Prop 99 that we're looking to use to offset general fund costs in Medi-Cal.
But some of these we had offset general fund costs from 99 for years.
For the Expanded Access to Primary Care program, we funded with a combination of Prop 99 and general fund. This is the general fund component.
All right, well, this is another one where you better look at the long term and the cost shifting that you're doing here. These are all preventive care programs that, to the extent they're not available, are likely to have rather severe impacts on emergency rooms.
These individuals are generally not served in the Medi-Cal program, so they're not people for whom we pay the costs associated with some of the other services.
Great. So we'll just dump it on the hospitals and hope they stay open.
All right.
Yeah, Madam Chair,
Yes.
if I may, Madam Chair.
Daly.
Again, I just want to underscore what Senator Duchesne just mentioned. Again, these are folks who don't have HMOs, they don't have PPOs, they don't have anything at all whatsoever. This is literally the only safety net they have. Remove this altogether, and they have nothing at all whatsoever. These are agricultural workers who are seasonal, but they're the ones who are picking the food that's put on our table. So obviously, we'll talk about this much more in detail as we go in the next few days and next few weeks. But I just want to underscore what Ms. Duchesne just said right now.
Okay, let's go on to the next item.
The next item is to eliminate general fund in the maternal, child, and adolescent health program. There's a variety of different programs that are funded with these funds. Some of it is research activity, birth defect monitoring, for example. Some of it is community-based services and other programs, Black Infant Health being another example of those types of programs that would be reduced as a result of this reduction. There is a relationship between these and some federal funds.
So this is prenatal care, infant health care.
It's different types of programs. Some of it is research, for example, birth defects monitoring.
I'm wondering about the direct services we provide to actual people.
It's generally going to be more of community-based services and public health type of interventions versus fee-for-service type of programs.
That's not really giving me the information that I want. I'd like to know what kinds of direct care services will we not be providing to people, particularly pregnant women, women that have just given birth, newborn babies. I mean, any number, we could think of any number of horror stories that could potentially happen where people end up in local emergency rooms because they haven't gotten the preventive care they need. And that's what I'd like to know, as well as the standing question of how many people will be affected.
We'll get you that information. The principal program that provides services in this area is the FPAC program, and I'm forgetting what that acronym stands for. And
Federal, that's the 9-to-1 federal.
And that program is not, we're not making a reduction to that direct services program other than the rate reduction. So here we're looking at maintaining the program that tends to provide most of the direct services and eliminating funding for some of the other programs. We'll get you additional information about the direct service impact of this, but we've tried to protect the direct services program.
Except in the item above. All right. I mean, I think we're going to have to combine these, because what this is telling me, there's an awful lot of, maybe there's too many programs. I can buy that. I mean, that maybe we got too many different programs trying to serve the same populations, and we need to look at, why there's so many of them and focus our resources on the ones that are the most preventative, the most cost-effective, and the ones that have the least, have the best economic impact on keeping people, and things like not having hospitals close and some of those kinds of issues that could come out of these. That maybe there are too many programs. I can accept that premise at this point because you identified so many. So maybe we need all the programs, and maybe some you haven't even put on the table. We need to look at what are all the programs that are kind of focused on serving a particular population, and then say, okay, maybe we don't need 10 different programs. Maybe we can, one program can offer the array of services needed rather than operating so many different levels.
Well, I think that's worth looking into, and I can accept that there's too many overlapping programs. What I can't accept is cutting every single program that provides prenatal care to poor pregnant women, or infant care to poor newborn babies, or food or health care services, preventive health care services to poor children. And that's where we're seeing dozens of programs like that. If we can look at consolidating and providing more efficient services, that would be a much better, in my opinion, way of approaching the problem than simply eliminating all of them that serve different populations but all in the same way. All right, we can go on to the next item.
The next item is we'll provide you the additional kind of cash management strategies that go with this on June 1st when we have our cash flows. But basically, we look at a variety of different cash options, deferrals, and other solutions to reduce our need for funds to finance the budget in the coming year.
Mr. Taylor, did you have comments you wanted to make in response?
Just generally, when you take up the individual items, certainly my colleagues will be able to respond to many of the questions you've asked on loss of federal funds, the beneficiaries, recipient, who's affected, these cost shifts, whether it's to individuals, to other levels of government. So they'll be able to help you on those questions. I would just say we also have some options which we try to, in some cases, reduce programs without the loss of federal funds. One case is in ADAP, another is CalWORKS, both of which we give you less savings, but where you don't lose any federal funds. So you do have some opportunities where you can get some savings, but hopefully in a smarter way. But that's not to say that you're going to have to go in areas where you're not going to feel comfortable going. You're going to have to lose some federal funds to get state savings, but there are ways that you can do it, and I think in a smarter way.
Yes, Mr. Nielsen.
You made the point a bit earlier, Mr. Taylor, too, and I'd like to follow up on that just a little bit. Sometimes finance has to come with kind of an either-or, a more drastic response. Whatever actions are taken here through 2011 may not be the actions that hold forever. And actions that can be taken, as you've just noted, do not have to be complete elimination. There can be a phasing down, a scaling back, a phasing out rather than just an immediate, cumulative which could end up with as equal amount of savings as just an outright wipeout of a program. Is that not correct?
I think that's true.
Incorporating in it some evaluations of the programs along the way, too. That's one of the things I think we've been remiss for decades around here about.
Any final questions or comments from committee members? I think, Mr. Nielsen, what you said was very fair, and I think we're going to have to pursue that. It will take some time. It will take some more analysis and more information. But I think you can see now that we've gone through these items, the source of my frustration that I was expressing in my opening statement today. And what really does concern me is this is a state that is the size of a world-class economy, and yet we are looking at eliminating programs that help women and children who are in the poorest of circumstances. And to me, that's backwards. I just don't see that as being the way in which we ought to start. And so looking at consolidating services, providing them in a more efficient manner, perhaps making sure they're not going to folks that don't truly need them, that I'm okay with. But, just simply getting rid of them without careful analysis and study, that truly bothers me. And what really bothers me is when folks, such as the gentleman in my hometown, say, well, we're looking forward to this. I don't think this is anything anybody here looks forward to. I don't think anybody in this audience looks forward to it either. It just makes it that much more difficult. I do want to go over what the schedule is for tomorrow. It's a little bit complex. It's a very long day. We're going to be starting our first public hearing. We will begin at 9 a.m. We do expect quite a number of folks to come and testify, and there are some ground rules for testimony tomorrow. Because of the number of people we expect to show up, we will be having a very strict time limit on testimony, and testimony will be limited to 2 minutes or less, depending on the item and the number of people we expect to testify. And the less is at the discretion of the chair. So I will announce during each segment how much time people have to testify. When groups are here, we would prefer it if the groups would nominate one spokesperson and then acknowledge the other members in the audience so that not everybody gets up and testifies. We don't want people saying the same thing. Written testimony is very highly encouraged. We will have staff here with comment cards so that you can fill out your name, your affiliation, and your comment, so that if we're unable to get to you or if you don't have sufficient time to testify to everything you wanted to say, it will be submitted in writing to the committee, and we can consider it. So at 9 a.m., we will be starting with Medi-Cal and Healthy Families. At 10:30, we will move on to Public Health, Drugs in Medi-Cal, Proposition 36, and Emergency Medical Services. At noon, we'll go to Developmental Services. At 1:30, In-Home Supportive Services and Aging. 3 o'clock, CalWORKS, SSI, SSP, CFAP, and CAPI. And at 4 o'clock, Child Welfare Services and Foster Care. And we do hope to complete the hearing by 5 p.m. So as I said, this is a very, very ambitious agenda, and we are looking forward to hearing from the public for the first time in conference committee. We will have changes to the governor's proposal as we go along, so we may have to reconvene at a later date and discuss these issues. Again, a reminder, the entire agenda for the committee is posted on the Assembly Budget Committee website, and it will be updated as things change. And it should also be in the daily file, but as I noted earlier today, it was incorrect. So if you have any doubts, look on the Assembly Budget Committee website. So thank you very much, members. Ms. Matasantos and Mr. Taylor, really appreciate coming here. I know it was a very difficult hearing to get through, and it probably won't be the last, but we appreciate you being here.
And Madam Chair, the ADAP caseload is 35,700 individuals.
35,700. All right. Thank you. We're adjourned for today.